The decommission notice came on the 24th of December, which Mara Solis thought was either the universe's idea of a joke or proof that the universe had no sense of humor at all. She read it twice in the cramped bunk of the ESV Caldwell, the recycled air tasting like aluminum and old coffee, the overhead light flickering in its usual 3-second rhythm. Her contract with the Xenobiology Survey Corps had ended. Her field partner of 6 years had submitted a separation request 2 weeks prior. Professional separation, the form said, though. That was a cleaner word than the one Mara kept using when she was alone. The Corps had processed everything faster than expected. She had 14 hours to vacate her station assignment aboard Relay Post Vega 9 before the quarterly resupply shuttle arrived. 14 hours on a station where she'd spent the last 8 months cataloging the behavioral patterns of the Thon, a low-gravity species that communicated through bioluminescent pulses and seemed to find human facial expressions both baffling and hilarious. 8 months of meticulous charts, cross-referenced field notes, 3-dimensional behavioral maps rendered in the margins of her notebooks in colored ink. 8 months of learning to be patient, learning to watch, learning how to be still enough that something alien might trust you. She was apparently very bad at applying those same skills to relationships. Mara folded the notice into a small square and pushed it into the breast pocket of her field jacket. She sat on the bunk for a moment. The station hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, the water recycler kicked on, groaned, settled, she thought. I should feel something, she thought. I'll feel it later. She stood, pulled her gear bag from under the bunk, and began to pack with the methodical calm of a woman who had decided, quite consciously, that the next chapter of her life would not involve needing anyone else. She had been good at this once. Before the Corps, before the partnership, before she'd made the mistake of letting another person's orbit pull her off her own course. She would be good at it again. People were capable of learning. That was, after all, the whole premise of her field. The idea that if you watched something carefully enough and long enough, you began to understand the logic of how it moved through the world. She would watch herself carefully. She would figure out the logic. The recycling bay was in sub-level 3, a place most of the station's 8-person skeleton crew avoided because of the noise and the heat and the faint smell of chemical solvent that the ventilation system never quite cleared. It was the only place on Vega 9 that functioned as something like a laundromat, a row of industrial purge cycle containers where personnel could clean and repressurize their field suits and run their laundry through a decontamination cycle before leaving the station. Protocol required it before departure. No organic material from the survey zone could leave on clothing fibers. She'd have to wait out 2 full purge cycles, approximately 90 minutes each. 3 hours, minimum, in sub-level 3, alone, which was fine. That was the plan. She loaded her suits and her worn field shirts into the first container, punched in her code, listened to the heavy drum begin its rotation with a sound like distant thunder. She pulled a folding stool from the wall rack, set it up beside the container, and opened her field notebook to a blank page. She had half a mind to start drafting her final behavioral report on the Thon. Something comprehensive enough to be useful to whoever took over her post. She owed them that much. Not the Corps, not her former partner, but the Thon themselves. They had trusted her with their patterns. They deserved to be understood. She was 3 sentences into the introduction when the emergency airlock at the far end of the bay cycled open. Mara was on her feet before she'd processed what she was seeing, because her nervous system had been trained by 8 months in proximity to beings that could kill you by accident, and the shapes that came through airlocks uninvited were never good news. She had her handheld scanner in her hand. She always had her scanner. It was practically grafted to her. Before she registered that the figure stumbling through the airlock was not a station crew member, was not human at all, and was very clearly dying. The Thon moved differently on their home station than they did in the survey zone. Mara knew this the way she knew the 3-second flicker of the light above her bunk, by proximity, by repetition, by the accumulated weight of paying attention. In the survey zone, they glided. Low gravity, wide shallow bodies like living mantas, bioluminescent patches along the dorsal ridge firing in complex overlapping sequences. Here, in standard human gravity, they moved like something dragged. This one was dragging itself. It was small, juvenile, she thought, or possibly female. The gender dimorphism was still a point of uncertainty in her notes, and it had made it perhaps 4 meters through the airlock before its body simply gave out. It folded against the deck with a sound that Mara would not be able to describe accurately to anyone who had never heard it. A wet collapse, something between a sigh and a seal breaking. The bioluminescent patches on its dorsal ridge were firing in a pattern she recognized. She recognized it because she had seen it exactly once before, on the third week of her first survey post, when a Thon elder had been demonstrating communication sequences for the behavioral database. The pattern was not complex. It was one of the most primitive sequences in the Thon vocabulary, the equivalent of something pre-linguistic, pre-social, older than language, older than culture. It meant, I am here, I am here, I am here. Mara crossed the bay in 8 steps. She knelt beside it on the deck, not touching, not yet, because you never touched a Thon without permission, and she wasn't sure this one was conscious enough to give permission. She held the scanner flat, running a passive bioscan, non-invasive, no emissions, just receiving, and watched the readout scroll. Respiratory function compromised. Cardiac analog elevated and erratic. External pressure trauma along the left lateral membrane consistent with decompression. It had been in a vacuum or near one. Hey, Mara said, which was not a clinical thing to say, but she had learned that tone of voice mattered to the Thon even when words did not. The dorsal ridge flickered. A new sequence, brief and fragmented, like a sentence started and abandoned. She reached into her field jacket and found by feel the small pocket on the interior left side where she kept a photon marker, a tool for tagging survey specimens that emitted a soft, adjustable light. She clicked it to its lowest setting, a dim amber glow, and held it up near the Thon's dorsal ridge without touching, letting it see the light without being overwhelmed. The bioluminescent patches steadied fractionally. The I am here pattern slowed, became less frantic. It was responding to the light. Of course it was. It was scared, and it was reaching for the one thing it knew how to use to communicate, and she had answered it in the only language available. They were both working with what they had. I know, she said. I'm here too. She spent the next 20 minutes doing what she was trained to do, not the decommissioned notice version of herself. Not the woman who had been packing a bag and writing herself permission slips for solitude, but the other one. The one who had spent 8 months learning how to be trusted by something that had no reason to trust her. She did not attempt to move the Thon. She talked, low and even, not because it understood her words, but because it could read the rhythm of her voice the way she could read the rhythm of its light. She used the scanner to map the pressure damage and assessed, with the kind of grim practical clarity that fieldwork teaches you, what she could and could not do alone. She could not close the lateral membrane wound without a medical kit from Deck 2. She could reach the emergency comm panel on the wall behind her in 6 steps. She could call the crew. She reached for the comm panel and stopped. If she called the crew, the standard response protocol would trigger station quarantine, core notification, an incident file, and the Thon, this juvenile or female or unknown, who had dragged itself through a vacuum airlock to reach the only person on the station who had bothered to learn its language, would become a paperwork problem, a specimen, a thing to be processed and returned and documented, and in the processing, something would be lost. She'd seen it happen. She'd seen it happen to herself. She thought about the decommissioned notice folded in her breast pocket. She thought about the plan to be alone. She pulled her med kit from her gear bag. The Thon's name, the closest human phonetics could get to it, was something like a chord played on an instrument that didn't exist. Mara had 3 different attempts at transliterating it in her field notes and had eventually given up and used a symbol instead, a small sketch of the specific bioluminescent pattern that accompanied its name response. She used that pattern now with the photon marker, the slow pulse she associated with address, with naming, with I am speaking to you specifically. The dorsal ridge answered with something that might have been recognition. I'm going to touch you, Mara said. On the left side, I'll be gentle. She waited. The light pattern shifted. It was not a clear yes, but it was not a no. She had learned over 8 months that the space between not no and yes was where almost everything real happened. That was true of the Thon. That was probably true of most things. She worked with the medkit for an hour. The lateral membrane was more resilient than human skin, tougher, less prone to catastrophic failure, but it had been compromised along a 12-centimeter line and needed to be sealed before the underlying respiratory tissue lost any more pressure integrity. She used the biosealant meant for human suit punctures, which she was reasonably confident would work on Thon membrane biology based on her notes on their cellular composition, and she applied it with the same precision she used for her behavioral charts. Small, careful, unhurried. The purge cycle finished and she didn't notice. A second cycle began, triggered automatically. Because she'd set it to run twice, the recycling bay hummed. The drum turned. The Thon's bioluminescence gradually settled from the fragmented, panicking frequencies of I am here into something slower and more complex, something she had to concentrate to read, cross-referencing against 8 months of observation. It took her a long time. Some of the sequences were ones she'd never documented. She made notes in her field notebook, in the margins of the unfinished behavioral report, in colored ink, the way she always did. It was asking her something. She was almost sure of it. The question, as best she could reconstruct it, was something like, "Why are you still here?" She put her pen down, looked at the question for a moment in her own notation, which was a mess of symbols and marginal arrows that nobody else could read. The Thon watched her with the lateral organs along its mantle that served as sensory receptors, not eyes exactly, but something analogous. "I was waiting for my laundry," she said. The dorsal ridge pulsed in a way she had documented 3 times before. Always in response to something unexpected, always in a context that suggested something like amusement. She had tentatively labeled it in her notes as humor adjacent, uncertain, requires further study. "My posting ended today," she said. "I was going to leave. I had a plan." She looked at the gear bag against the wall, the folded decommission notice, the packed up orderly remains of 8 months. "I had a plan to be alone for a while, to not need anything." She paused. It's not that easy. The Thon produced a sequence she didn't recognize. Long, slow, multitonal in its light frequencies. She watched it carefully, pen poised. She had the feeling of being on the edge of something. The feeling she got in field work right before a Thon demonstrated a behavior she hadn't cataloged yet, when the world got very still and very clear. She wrote as fast as she could. She thought, "If I leave this station tomorrow, I will never understand what this is saying to me," she thought. "I cannot leave before I understand what this is saying to me." This was, she recognized, not entirely rational. This was, she recognized, very human. The nearest thing she had to a translation, built from pattern analogs and guesswork and 8 months of paying attention. "You were here. You saw. You stayed." She sat back on her heels on the cold deck of the recycling bay. The purge cycle finished a second time. The drum went quiet. In the silence, she could hear the 3-second flicker of the light she'd carried in her gear bag, out of habit. She'd packed the wrong light, the one from above her bunk, the one that flickered. She'd packed it without thinking. "Yeah," she said, "I stayed." She thought about the design of her behavioral charts, the ones that her former partner had always found excessive, too detailed, too committed to capturing the texture of small moments rather than the broad strokes of pattern. She had always argued that the texture was the pattern. That if you wanted to understand how something moved through the world, you had to be interested in the small things. The way the Thon paused before entering an unfamiliar space. The specific light sequence that appeared when 2 of them shared a meal. The way a juvenile, cornered and terrified and halfway dead on the floor of a recycling bay, would reach for the most primitive signal in its vocabulary. "I am here. I am here. Tell me you're here too." She had designed her charts to capture that. She had been told her charts were inefficient. She thought her charts were the best thing she'd ever made. She pulled out the incomplete behavioral report and turned to a new page, and began to write the account of the past 3 hours with the same care she gave everything. Date, time, environmental conditions, behavioral sequences documented, her own responses and their apparent effects. She wrote for an hour. The Thon was still. Its bioluminescence had settled into a low, steady pattern she associated with sleep, or the Thon equivalent of sleep, a state of reduced activity that she had cautiously labeled resting trust in her notes, because it only appeared in the presence of individuals the Thon had already assessed as safe. It was, she understood, a significant thing to be in the presence of. At some point she realized she was crying, which surprised her, because she had been so certain she had nothing left to cry about and had filed that under problems to address later. When she was alone, when she had the time and the privacy and the carefully managed solitude she had planned so thoroughly. She was crying in a recycling bay on a station she was supposed to have left hours ago, beside an alien who was asleep because it had decided she was safe, writing notes in the margins of a report that was technically already completed. She wiped her face on her field jacket sleeve and kept writing. When the Thon woke, and she knew when it woke because the resting trust pattern shifted into something more active and she had the exact timestamp, it produced a sequence she had documented only 4 times, always between Thon who had shared a significant experience, always between individuals who were not strangers anymore. Her notation for it was inadequate. She'd written, reciprocal recognition, marker of relational status change, possibly, I know you now in a way I did not before. She had not expected to receive it from a species other than her own. She held up the photon marker and answered with the closest human-produced analog she could construct. The pattern she'd always associated with acknowledgement, with the specific weight of I see you and I remember you. The Thon's dorsal ridge lit up in a long, sweeping pulse that she had never seen before in 8 months of survey work. She wrote it down. She drew it. She labeled it, unknown, first documentation, context, Christmas Eve, Recycling Bay, Sublevel 3, Station Vega 9. She drew the shape of it in the margin with the blue ink she used for new behavioral categories, a wobbly ellipse representing the sweep of light across the alien's body, surrounded by small arrows indicating sequence direction. She thought, I will spend the rest of my career trying to understand what that meant. She thought, I am glad I stayed to see it. By the time the station's skeleton crew noticed that the night shift recycling bay was still occupied, it was past 0200. The crew chief came down expecting a malfunctioning machine and found instead Mara Solis sitting on the floor with her back against the industrial drum and her field notebook open across her knees, and a juvenile Thon asleep 3 feet away, one of its bioluminescent patches pulsing in the slow, steady rhythm she had labeled resting trust, as if it had known her for years. The crew chief stared. Mara looked up from her notebook. I'm going to need to delay my departure, she said, and I'm going to need to send some messages. I have a report to finish. The crew chief looked at the Thon, looked at the 4 pages of notes she'd just written, looked at her face, which was blotched and honest and completely unbothered by being found on the floor of a recycling bay at 0200 on Christmas morning. The shuttle doesn't leave for 6 hours, the crew chief said. I know, she said. She didn't tell him she wouldn't be on it. She had already decided, somewhere in the 2nd hour of meticulous documentation, in the margin notes and the careful blue ink and the alien's steady breathing beside her, that the plan to be alone had been a plan made by someone who hadn't understood yet what aloneness actually cost. She had been trying to plan her way around grief, around loss, around the specific vulnerability of having let another person become load-bearing in her interior architecture. She had thought that removing herself from the structure would be strength. The Thon's dorsal ridge pulsed in sleep. I am here, the old frequency said, below language, below thought. I am here. She had answered it. She had not walked away. That was not the same as needing. That was not the same as the dependency she'd been trying to excise. That was something different. The choice to stay made with full knowledge of what staying cost. The choice to be interested in something more than her own careful solitude. The choice to document, meticulously and with colored ink, the things that couldn't be understood quickly. She finished the report at 0330. She started a new one at 0331. This one was titled, First Documentation of Thon Voluntary Airlock Transit Under Extreme Physical Duress, Behavioral and Communication Analysis. She had 17 pages of notes to draw from. She thought it might be the best work she'd ever done. She thought of her field charts, the excessive ones, the ones that captured texture instead of just pattern. She thought of her former partner's voice, tired and distant on the comm, saying that she was too invested, that she made everything too personal, that the work was supposed to be clinical, and she couldn't seem to keep herself out of it. She thought, no, the being interested was the work. The staying was the data. The small, careful attention paid to the thing that others walked past. That was the whole point. That was what the Thon had tried to do for 8 months, and what she had finally managed to do back. Outside the recycling bay's single porthole, the star field was unchanged. The Thon slept. The drum sat quiet. Somewhere overhead, a shuttle was being prepped for departure. Her departure, the orderly conclusion of a chapter she had thought was about learning to be alone. She picked up her pen. She began page 18. When the core response team arrived 4 days later, dispatched after her message outlined the nature of the incident with characteristic Mara Solis thoroughness, complete with bioscan data, behavioral documentation, and a 23-page preliminary analysis. They found her in the recycling bay with a full portable lab setup she'd borrowed from the station's equipment locker. The Thon ambulatory and functional and sitting 3 feet away from her while she ran a careful, consensual behavioral assessment. The photon marker in her hand, the two of them exchanging light patterns like a conversation that had been going on for days. Because it had been. The core response team lead was a man named Dr. Hessler, who had 12 years of xenobiology fieldwork and had never once cried in a recycling bay, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment watching the exchange before he understood what he was looking at. He had read Mara Solis's field reports. He had found them excessive, too detailed, too personal. He understood them now. "Dr. Solis," he said. She held up one finger, the universal field signal for "don't interrupt. Subject is performing observable behavior." And he stopped. He waited. The Thon produced a long, multi-frequency sequence that Mara tracked with her scanner, while simultaneously writing in the margin of a field notebook that was, by this point, almost entirely margin. She nodded, slowly, in the way she'd learned the Thon associated with acknowledgement. She made a notation. She drew a small ellipse in blue ink. Then she looked up. "Dr. Hessler," she said, "I need to show you something." She turned the notebook toward him. Page after page of notations and small drawings and question marks and tentative labels. "This is the first documented instance of voluntary Thon-to-human relational bonding initiated by the Thon, not the human." She paused. "It came to me. I didn't go to it." He crossed the bay slowly. He looked at the notes. "Your posting was terminated," he said. "Yes." "You were supposed to leave 4 days ago." "Yes." He looked at the Thon, which was watching him with its lateral sensory organs in the posture Mara had labeled Active Assessment Unknown Entity, which was different from Active Assessment Known Entity in 3 specific ways she had documented extensively. "Your contract is up," he said. "I'm aware." She looked at the Thon. The Thon's dorsal ridge produced a brief pattern she had cataloged as patience prompt. She had seen it between Thon when one was waiting for the other to finish talking to someone else. She found it, as she had found many things over the past 8 months, quietly extraordinary. "I thought I was done," she said. "I thought I wanted to be alone for a while. I had a very specific plan. What happened to the plan?" She looked at the 23 pages she'd written in 4 days, at the margin drawings in colored ink, at the Thon, waiting patiently for the unknown entity to finish talking so it could resume the conversation it had begun by dragging itself through a vacuum airlock toward a light in the dark. "I found something harder to walk away from," she said. Hessler looked at the notes for a long time. He was quiet in the way that scientists were quiet when they were recalibrating, when something new had arrived in their understanding and they were making room for it. "We'll need to extend your contract," he said finally. "I know. Indefinitely, probably." "I know." He handed the notebook back to her. She set it on her knee and picked up the photon marker and turned back to the Thon, which had waded through the whole conversation with the particular quality of patience she could now read as a flavor. Patient. But interested, not patient and indifferent. It wanted to continue, so did she. She had come down to sub-level 3 to be alone, to wait out the cycle and leave, to implement the plan and move through grief with the clean efficiency she'd convinced herself was strength. She had come down with a gear bag and a decommission notice, and the sincere intention of never again letting the texture of another being's existence become load-bearing in her own. She clicked the photon marker to amber. The Thon's dorsal ridge answered immediately, that long, sweeping pulse she'd first documented on Christmas Eve, the one she'd never seen before or since, the one she still hadn't found an adequate label for in her notebook. She had tried 3 times and scratched out all 3 attempts. The most recent attempt, penciled in the margin and underlined twice, was only slightly better than the others. It said, "Found." Outside, stars, the station's hum. Somewhere in the distance, a shuttle completing a route she wasn't on. She kept the light steady. The Thon kept answering. She wrote it all down.